Hello and welcome to LangTime Chat, episode 48, where we're going to be talking about tense and aspect. And David is super stoked.
What?
You're stoked.
Oh, I'm very stoked like a fire. Ugh.
Okay.
Uh,
Or David's tired. I don't know.
all jokes aside, you know what I'm always excited about?
LangTime.
No, actually, most of the time it's a wearying prospect.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
No, I always look forward to chatting with you about things for like an hour. It's a delightful, delightful thing.
Well, that's very sweet. Well, hopefully they enjoy it as much as we do.
Mm.
And here we go. The very first thing that I want to teach everyone about aspect,
Yeah,
which maybe they know, but
I know what's coming.
this is new information for me. And this is titled, Just a Fact I Need to Share. There's an example sentence in the dictionary for the definition of aspect that was, the sun is superbly aspected by your ruler Mars on the 19th. So apparently aspect as a verb, and the reason I really went to this was I was looking up some other information about, tense and aspect to incorporate. And at one point it was like aspect as a verb. And I was like, how? And so I looked it up in the dictionary and sure enough, there it was. It is apparently a verb used in astrology and really only in astrology by this use where it's something about being positioned in line with or something, I think. So I think what this is saying is like the sun is positioned in a way that one kind of overlaps another or something. I don't know, but it just threw me so off guard when I read this sentence because I was like, this may have read Green Ideas Sleep Furiously to me.
Yeah.
Where it's like, I see all of these are words. I get that this is a sentence structure, but what?
In fact, just a little conlang aside, if you're ever looking for inspiration, especially when it comes to not necessarily creating brand new words, but saying, well, I have this vocabulary, but I'm looking for, ideas about how to expand it. In other words, ways to zero derive these words so that they have other meanings that doesn't simply mirror English. A good place to research is actually cults and religions and things that somehow kind of toe that line. For example, these not cults necessarily, but schemes.
The first time you said that word, by the way, I totally thought you said colt as in like a small horse. And I was like, yeah, look into horses. Do that. But watch videos.
I was thinking like pyramid schemes and things like that. Scams. That's it. Scams.
Oh, yeah.
Because there is a lot of intentional, not misuse, but like new usages of old words. It's a way of determining, like for the scammer, for example, if you've really bought in and you're a part of the in-group, if you know like how they use this terminology and you're using it the same way, it's like, aha, basically they have made it to here and therefore I can,
That just reminded me of this Ugly Betty episode where there is something along those lines where there's this Phoenix water and like, but you only get access to the Phoenix water if you're phase 4 or higher of the group. And like, so anyway, that just totally reminded me of that.
Yeah. And what you get is sentences a lot like this, where it's like you look at it and you have that exact reaction. You're like, I'm a native English speaker. I know every single word in this sentence, but I don't know what's being said. It is exactly that type of thing where you see some of the most creative and bizarre extrapolations in the vocabulary of some of these, cults and schemes and stuff. It can serve as interesting inspiration. Anyway.
And so that's a really cool side note, by the way. I never would have thought to recommend looking into such things, but now that you say that, I'm thinking like, oh yeah, there is some really interesting semantic extension going on in a lot of those. And so that's really where the inspiration would help you is new ways to think about semantics of words. All right, so we're going to talk, though. We're not talking about aspect as a verb. We're talking about it as a noun and talking about tense and aspect specifically. There are a lot of things that verbs can do, and David, I think, is very famous for basically saying, "Oh man, verbs! What horrible, awful things are they going to do?" And like in many ways, he's right, because languages. We're going to be talking about some tense and aspect in here, but at the same time, it's like languages don't use it the same way. Like you can define a single grammatical tense, find it in 20 languages, and then find out that they translate roughly the same idea very differently using the same tense system, just because languages can do that.
I want to just I'm noting humorously here. Jessie, rather famously at this point, just got done with her first stint of jury duty, where she actually served on a jury.
And this is, yes.
And the title of the slide that she has here is Tense v. Aspect.
Yeah, 2024. It was the great case where it was tense v. aspect. And I'm not going to ruin it for you. I'm not going to tell you who's the defendant, who's, the other one.
I think the order of it tells you which is which, but...
Oh, you know what? You got something there, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But I will say about verbs, like I complain about them all the time because for two reasons. One, it's a lot of work, and two, it's very difficult to get right. It's much easier to create like, a number system or a noun case system that kind of passes muster than it is to create a verbal system. And so it's not like, I don't like them thinking like, oh, we should just not have any verbs in this language. But it's more the pressure that you feel to create something that is really interesting and works with your language, that is actually faithful and works, and doesn't look super fake. Yeah.
And I will say on the layman side of this, it can be incredibly difficult to find good sources about what constitutes tense, what constitutes aspect, and what options you may have to consider whenever you sit down to create such a system for your language. There's a lot of conflation of these terms in sort of everyday literature that you may find, online, that specifically when you go to look these up on, Google or whatever, you may end up just getting tons of sources about English grammar and the ways that they are described, what gets called a tense in English, which is not necessarily linguistically a tense. So anyway, it can be really tricky. And so our goal here is really to just break it down and say, like, here's this system, how do they operate? And yeah, just to hopefully kind of sort of set that tone of like what counts as a tense, what counts as an aspect. Yeah.
Yep.
And it's difficult. I will also, one last thing before I actually move ahead. I actually took an entire graduate level class on tense and aspect.
Oh, really?
It was a doctoral level course, right? So like highest of the highest. And it was just called tense and aspect. Like that was the entire class, was just tense and aspect. And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you all that like by the end of the semester, I walked away feeling like nothing is a tense and everything could be a tense. An aspect is fake. No, just kidding.
Wow.
But like, you look at so much data and how it's applied in languages. And again, it's like, it can be so wildly different when you're looking at this data across languages and trying to say, well, this is, I guess, technically a tense, but the way it's applied is so different from language to language that it can be sort of mind-boggling. And then when you try to have discussions about it, you start getting all in your own head about like, well, how would I say that even in English? And like, you start convincing yourself that you would say things grammatically some way in English that later on you're thinking back going, oh, no, I guess I would never actually say that. And it's just, it gets in your head. It's a really deep conversation. Anyway.
I was thinking of something. I wish I had the specific example. I should have written it down. But I was writing something the other day. And I was rereading it rather, and I decided to change the matrix verb. And when I did, it was the same type of verb, same category, same tense. I went and looked, and the subordinate clause that followed it previously had a rare instance of the English subjunctive. And then when I read it, I was like, oh my God, you can't use the subjunctive there anymore with this verb. And I just knew it, and I had no idea why. I should have I should have written it down.
I wish you had, because I would love to see that.
Because it just felt like, in some cases it's like, I wish I were a fireman. I wish I was a fireman. It's like, they both sound good. This was one where with the previous verb, were sounded fine. With the next one, you absolutely 100% could not use it. It just made absolutely no sense and really took me by surprise.
Beautiful.
Anyway.
All right, so we're going to set these up as systems and define them in some basic terms, starting with tense. And if a language has a tense system generally for its verbs, it prioritizes when something occurs. In other words, it's really prioritizing more a timeline of events, if you will. Where often points on the timeline, so quite often tense will, say like present versus past, maybe future. Some tense systems will even be like, distant past versus recent past and distant future versus recent future and so on. But in all those instances, it's really prioritizing a timeline. Now, how that timeline actually operates when you're applying it to verbs may or may not be the same. Where, we can talk about examples later whenever we'll briefly discuss English, but I'll go ahead and say English is kind of famous for its non-past tense, which is often used as the present tense, is not usually often used for the actual present moment, but for many other things. So it's like how it actually gets applied may be a little bit different, but it prioritizes the when of it all. And the timeline itself is going to be, sort of relative to the point of speaking. So like when you're saying something and you're saying, what's happening right now or what just happened or whatever. So it's relative to the point of speaking. Or it can also be relative to the point of view when narrating. And so what I mean by that is when you're telling a story, you have the option of putting yourself into the story and using tense relative to where you were in the story versus where you are right now speaking. And so that's a fun little factoid. Aspect, on the other hand, prioritizes a state of completion or a state of being in progress. So it's prioritizing an event and its unfolding, if you will, to say, is it done? Is it still ongoing? Is it, in some cases, partially done? So it really is prioritizing looking at events and their conclusions and how they're unfolding versus a timeline of when they happened. And here, these states of events and their relative, finishedness or unfinishedness are relative to, again, a point of speaking, or they can also be relative to a point of view when you're narrating. And so that is sort of the overview of tense versus aspect. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to talk about some terms that you need to know because we're going to use these. And so this is sort of just the baseline. Here's some vocabulary. So first, we're going to talk about sometimes things are inflected on a verb. And so inflection is marked on the verb, and it's going to follow the same patterns as other grammatical inflections in the language. And so here, I say it's marked on a verb, but that doesn't mean that it's an affix. It could be a, separate particle that occurs with the verb because perhaps it's a more analytic language and grammatical particles are much more common than affixes. And that's a normal pattern for that language for inflections. And so inflection, though, is contrasted grammatically in terms of how it's done by periphrasis or periphrastic constructions. Where periphrastic constructions are one of the stages of the grammaticalization cycle where it becomes a set phrase or a set way of saying things, and then it gets reduced until it potentially becomes an inflection. And then new phrases are formed to cover other aspects or other ways of talking about grammatical things. And so the key feature here is that it requires like a full construction or phrase. And so, for example, a lot of instances of periphrasis for English verbs will require auxiliaries and the main verb, or a string of auxiliaries in some cases, and a main verb.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that, David, before we?
No.
All right.
I know what's coming.
So David is excited. Coming up next is...
So excited for this audio podcast.
is an animation. I know I made an animation for a podcast. And it may sound funny, but what's going to happen is you're going to see frames of it. The PDF is not going to actually show the animation. So that's just going to have to be like a separate upload. It's just a silly little animation that I made where several things are going on. And so we're going to use it by way of giving examples for like, how would we break down each scene? What could we mark the verbs for in each scene, thinking of it as a larger scene? It is a very, very short animation to the point where when I hit play, it's going to like take just a few seconds. And in fact, it's going to be done playing before I even get done like narrating to tell you what's going on. So it's very short.
I don't want to skip over the fact that Jesse made a tiny little animated short. Can you believe that? That's extraordinary.
David's delighted by it.
It is. Look at this.
Well, they can't look.
I know. You'll have to see it. If you're a sighted individual, this will bring you joy.
All right. So to set the scene, what's going to happen whenever I do play the animation that you can't see through a podcast anyway? But to set the scene, we've got in the foreground, we have a mouse, and we're just going to call this mouse J Mouse. And J Mouse is standing beside a counter full of vegetables. It's just standing there right now, not doing anything with the vegetables. There is a cutting board, though. There are bowls that are empty, and there is a knife. And so, there's pretty good assumption that J Mouse is about to chop some veggies. In the background, you see the back of a couch, and you see a rabbit. Now, this rabbit we're going to call D Bunny. And D Bunny is working on a computer. You can see the computer screen. And you can't really see it unless you get super close, but I'm going to tell you what is on that computer screen. It is essentially a Font Lab 8 screen of the glyphs. And so, D Bunny's back there working on creating some glyphs. And so that's happening in the background. There's also a window, and in the window, you're going to see the sun move just by way of saying time is passing. And what you're going to find is, one, that J Mouse is extremely slow at chopping vegetables when you see how much the sun moves. And that, two, D Bunny is actually really quick at creating glyphs in this, because roughly the time it takes J Mouse to chop a carrot, D Bunny has created a new glyph. Like this is some fast work on the part of the bunny, slow work on part of the mouse.
Oh, and don't forget
At one point, you will also see the world's slowest bird fly past the window. And I needed to have the bird in several frames to make it clear that the bird was flying past the window. But if you see how much the sun moves before the bird actually makes it across the window, it's like, this poor bird is on some slow potion. And so it's just taking its sweet time. So more floating, perhaps, past the window. But here we go. I'm about to press play. And here we go. And so chopping carrots, chopping fennel, mushrooms were chopped, garlic was chopped. One other thing happens in the background as D Bunny is working and the glyph chart is getting filled. One other thing happens, and that's that at 3 different points, a ding occurs. The computer dings because it's like a text alert coming through the computer. And actually, if you know David, that's really the only alerts he gets is if his computer is open and his text will ding. Otherwise, his phone does not. So it's actually pretty representative of life. Mm-hmm. And so that is another thing that happens. So that is the entire animation. It's already done, by the way. So literally it was done by the time I said chopping some carrots, chopping some fennel. The animation was done. I still needed to catch you up on the mushrooms and the garlic, and that's how short it is.
It was wonderful.
Well, I'm glad David delights in it because we're going to be using it for this entire demonstration here. All right, so to again just ground you, we've got J Mouse is chopping vegetables, D Bunny is doing some font work in the background and does get 3 text notifications, and then there is a bird that has a flight right past the window. So those are the major things going on. Another way of grouping what's happening is to talk about them semantically. And in verb semantics, there are these terms that get used: activity, accomplishment, and achievement. And so breaking that down, we can talk about D-Bunny creating glyphs, J-Mouse chopping, and the bird flying as activities. Activities are usually defined as verbs that have some duration attached to them, like it takes some time to do them. And they are generally associated with being atelic, which means it's just ongoing. There's no defined end point. An accomplishment, on the other hand, also involves duration, but has a defined endpoint. So while J-Mouse chopping is an activity, when you put an object with it, like J-Mouse chopping the vegetables, now it's an accomplishment because there's an endpoint. There is going to be a point where the mouse is done chopping the vegetables, whereas chopping in general could just keep going for hours and hours because you could decide to chop fruit. You could, it's just like it just keeps going. Same with the bird flying. When you put a goal or some sort of, not really object in this case, but an end point to it, for instance, saying the bird flying past the window, now it's an accomplishment because there's an endpoint. Like there's at one point the bird is done flying past the window. Doesn't mean the bird is done flying, but flying past the window, done. So that adds a sort of telicity to the verb. It adds an endpoint, and that's the atelic versus telic distinction. The text dinging is considered an achievement because it doesn't have any duration. It happens and it's done. Like it's not like the ding can ding for 5 minutes and be interpreted as an ongoing ding. If I say it dinged for 5 minutes, in your head, you would have to interpret that as ding, 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 like an iterative interpretation, not an ongoing dinging.
Yeah.
What a weird little verb.
It
dinging. Anyway, so that's how achievements are different from those, is it lacks the duration. It is, however, telic because there's an endpoint. It happens, it's done. And so breaking those down into atelic versus telic, again, telicity is all about, does it have a sort of natural endpoint? Does it have a natural window for when it's finished? And so atelic means no, there is not. The A in this case is that sort of negator prefix, so it's not telic. So D-Bunny creating, J-Mouse chopping, bird flying, atelic. Telic has an endpoint, and this is where when you add vegetables behind chopping, so J-Mouse chopping vegetables, endpoint. Bird flying past window, done when it's past the window. Text dinging, it's over as soon as it happens. These are all telic. And these are important distinctions for how you think about applying, especially aspect, in my opinion. I think it can be really important with thinking about how you're going to apply different aspects to the verbs. All right, so for the focus of this discussion, we're going to use a 3-tense system and a 3-aspect system to just talk about some differences. These are by no means meant to be like representative of like, this is what you should consider if you're doing tense. This is really just, here's what we're going to use so that way we can talk about it. There are a lot of different ways that you could, have tense and aspect. So the 3 tenses we're going to use just for this example are past, present, future. And the 3 aspects are about to, so it's not happened yet, it's about to start. Continuing, which means it has started and it's ongoing, for that point. And then complete, which means it's finished. So continuing can also be referred to as the imperfective, and then complete or finished can be referred to as perfective.
A really quick note, it's very difficult, I think, for English speakers to distinguish between what we call like this kind of, I mean, it could be called an immediate future tense, but like between a future tense and the aspect that describes an activity that is about to occur or focusing on that, heading towards that beginning point. And so, and that's because we conflate the two.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because if you think about like, I'm going to eat now, that's describing something that is happening in the future or will happen in the future, but it's kind of, it's a perspective thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's looking at the activity about to start. The way to think about it is a true future tense, even though we're using the present tense in English for this, is saying something like, I fly to Europe next Thursday. That is something where you're not talking about aspect at all. You are not talking about something that's about to happen. You are instead looking at it as a timeline, saying this is an activity that is happening at some point in time in the future, a specific point, in fact, so it's next Thursday. But there's no aspectual information in that at all. It is pure tense. So when we talk about especially like future tense versus this about to aspect, try to hold that in your mind.
Yeah. Especially because sometimes they will apply to the same situation.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean that it means the same thing. Yeah. All right. And so David wanted the animation in again. So it's going to play again right now. Again on the podcast. He wanted it twice, not once. And there it goes. There it goes.
Oh, I love it.
And so you, more than anything, you just get to hear David's reaction. You're welcome, podcast listeners, for that happening. All right, so now let's break it down, David.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're going to do is I've pulled out like individual frames, and we'll talk about what's happening on the frame in question, and then we're going to talk about the verbs involved and ways we can mark them. And so here in this frame, the events that are happening is this is at the very beginning. And so again, this is where J Mouse is just standing in front of the counter, not touching anything, not reaching for the knife, not doing anything, just standing there, smiling though. So very happy to survey what work is about to be done. And then in the background, D-Bunny is creating some glyphs. And so that is all that's happening at this moment. And so I break down each of these slides. If you look at the presentation, or if you happen to be watching the video right now, when it is released at the end of season 6, you'll see on the presentation that I break it down using emojis for the nouns and for the concepts. But then the verbs get represented by words, because I wanted to kind of take it out of English as much as possible. But I needed the verbs to be there represented. So these are the most important things here. So the events here, we've got bunny, create, and then I chose a very beautiful glyph to represent the glyphs. Mm-hmm. And then mouse, chop, and then I put a carrot in there. So there's a little mouse face and there's a little carrot to represent that. But chop is the verb that we're going to insert here to talk about. So if we're going to go by a tense system, then the tense marking with the 3 tenses presented, the appropriate tenses here are that create would show up in marked for the present tense because it's happening right now. And chop would be future because it's like, yeah, it's immediate future. In some languages, this may be rendered as present because it's like so close to being now. It's kind of depends on the system and how it's applied. But it is not happening in this moment of narration, in this moment of the image.
There are a lot of languages that are like English in that there is a default tense, which is the present or future, and then a specific tense that refers to the past. And this is because, in general, you don't actually need anything to indicate the future. So Finnish is like this. Finnish is essentially like English was before it got the will auxiliary, because it's like if you say, I am eating, all right, this is present tense. If you say, I am eating at 7 p.m., I mean, that's still grammatical in English.
Yeah.
You know, if assuming that you're saying that at like 4 p.m., you're saying, hey, we're eating at 7 p.m. Everybody knows that you're talking about the future, so you don't need anything specific to talk about that. And so, like, if you say the mouse is chopping carrots, sure. But if you say the mouse is chopping carrots in a couple minutes, then that's clear enough. Anyway, incidentally, I wanted to point out, since we're talking about tense right now, the way that we got our future tense, and one of the reasons that it's so difficult for us to separate the aspect from the tense, is that both of them really, not shall, but for will and for going to. Will comes from want, and the idea was, this is the same will that we have in Do What You Will and Last Will and Testament. The idea is that if you say that you want to do something, it means that you're not doing it right now, right?
Yeah.
That is something that's implied. It's a strange thing if you say, like, I want to eat, and so I'm eating. Like, you could say, I wanted to eat, and so I'm eating now, but not like I want to eat, so I eat now. That doesn't, there's kind of like this logical, paradox there. And so the idea is that it's kind of an analogy. If you want to do something, it means you're not doing it right now. Saying that you want to do it implies that you might do something to make it so that you can do it in the future. And so it was a very short leap from saying, all right, well, how about, instead of saying, I will eat, meaning I want to eat, it means I'm going to do it in the future. And we just developed another word for want, that one coming from lack, of course. Because if you lack something, that means that you have some sort of a desire for it. Again, it was just like, well, move this, and then that's empty, so just move this. Suddenly that's empty. And so then we couldn't really use want anymore for lack. It is only used in very specific circumstances
We were
now.
left wanting for something new, eh?
There you go.
So yeah, that is
That was just about tense. Sorry.
a really, really good point. All right, and then we also have aspect here. This example, same example. So instead of having tense marked, here we're gonna, mark the verbs for aspect and prioritize their states of completion or ongoingness. And in this case, create. So with the bunny creating the glyphs, it's an ongoing thing. So it's a continuing event, and so it would be continuing.
I want to try
imperfective.
I want to try to offer another analogy about how to comprehend this, especially for those who grew up with English, which is very much a tense first system. Tense, very much a timeline, and basically the line itself is like the past is on one side, the future is on the other, and the points on the timeline are events. And so then you look at it and say, okay, is this event at a point that we call the present? Is it before that or is it after that? Aspect, on the other hand, ignores time and looks at events. And the events themselves become lines. They are event lines. And then what the aspects say is, what point in the line are we at? And so, for example, looking at create and chop, each one has a separate line, all right? Create, it says, we are in the middle of the event. That's the point in the line that we're at. It means that creating is happening. It's in the process. Well, what about for chop? We are at the point in the line before it happens, just before it happens. And so that's where we're at in the chopping event line. So it's basically like a timeline versus an event line.
So what I have done in the past to try to show, and I wish I had known you were going to say that. I could have actually had a slide with this breakdown. But what I have done in the past to show students the difference is on a tense timeline, you've got, an arrow going across a page, and it starts at one end, and then the arrowhead is pointing in a direction to the, for a left to right system, it's going from the left to the right. And in the middle, you've got a line representing now. And then you can put dots to say when things happened. So past, you put it, before the now, so to the left of the now. If it's happening now, you put a dot on the now. If it's going to happen in the future, you're going to put a dot to the right of the now. But these are like just marking when are these things happening relative on this timeline where the arrow represents time. On the other hand, for looking at aspect, what I do for me to show students, especially because these are easily typed, is I put square brackets and say these square brackets, they open and they close, they represent an event. And so then the arrow gets drawn relative to where you are in the event. And so the arrow begins, and if you're about to, the little arrowhead is going to stop before the square bracket opens because you're about to do the event. If it's continuing, then the arrow goes into, the middle of these two square brackets, but the arrowhead is somewhere in the middle because it's a continuing thing. If it's complete, then the arrowhead goes all the way through. And now the square brackets, that whole event, it has gone all the way through. And so like that's another way of like kind of thinking it's not dots on a timeline. It's like you're now looking at these square brackets representing the whole event. A box would also work if you could easily type a box and do this, right? But you're just trying to say like, where are you inside that event? And so that's same thing, but a way to visualize it. All right, so that is the opening frame. A little bit later, and by little bit, I mean like, I think this is actually the next frame. Now, D-Bunny is still creating, but gets a text notification. So there's the computer dinging in the background. And at this point, J-Mouse still not chopping, but is holding the knife, right? Like it's like holding the knife ready to start this. And so again, we've got our events. We've still got the bunny creating glyphs and the mouse with, chopping vegetables, whether J-Mouse has started or not. But the computer is dinging, and that is another event to add to that list. And so here on tense, this one is really iffy because it's like two are present tense. The bunny is, creating the glyphs present tense. In this very moment, the computer dings, so it's present tense. It's like it dings. The chopping has not yet started, but holding the knife, it's like right there. And so really this is, I think, speaker perception. What would you mark it as? And whoever's listening to the story would go with it because it's like, it's right there. It's about to happen. It's so immediate future that some people may look at that and go like, that really needs to be present tense.
Yeah. But it's interesting though, because if you did go with that, then there's just even less distinction. You're looking at these three distinct events and they all have present. It's funny. You can imagine a spectral speaker looking at that and saying, how?
Yeah. Because when you do it by aspect, they all get marked in different aspects according to the 3 aspect system I set up before the example. Because the creating glyphs, this is a continuing event, so it's going to be marked in the continuing or the imperfective aspect. But the dinging of the computer, remember that doesn't have any duration. So once it happened, it was done. And so that's complete. And so that would be, the complete aspect, or perfective is another word quite often used for that. But the chopping, still about to happen. And so we've got 3 different events in 3 different aspects. But it's all kind of like right here in that same frame.
Yep.
All right, moving forward. Now, J-Mouse is definitely chopping vegetables, so much so that 1 carrot's already chopped, working on the 2nd carrot. D-Bunny's still in the background creating those glyphs, and a bird is clearly visible in the window. And so we've got our three events here. If we break it down by tense, creating the glyphs, flying past a window, the bird flying past the window, and J-Mouse chopping vegetables, all in the present tense. All right now happening. In this case, aspect-wise, they're also all continuing because the creating glyphs still continuing. Flying past the window is continuing because the bird had started at one end. And remember, this is slowest bird ever, so the sun has moved 2 positions by now. But the bird is continuing the flight path past the window, and the chopping has commenced and is continuing.
Yeah, it's interesting that tense and aspect don't distinguish between these two. But technically, two of these are more alike than the other, which is the glyph creating. It's kind of an ongoing thing, especially if you imagine that this is High Valyrian and there's no real endpoint for this, as opposed to like I'm creating an alphabetic system and it's going to have 26 glyphs, and when I create those, it's done. It's really an ongoing event. On the other hand, as Jesse pointed out, the chopping of the vegetables is done when the vegetables are chopped. And the bird flying by the window, that is done once the bird has flown by. Now, the little toy systems we've come up here don't make a distinction with these, which is why they're all present or all continuous. But you can imagine either a system or maybe a lexical system that distinguishes between the two.
Yeah.
And so we have some lexical verbal pairs like this in English. I can't think of one. But like you could imagine, a verb A for create and then verb type V for fly and chop because they have endpoints.
Yeah. That's a very good point. If we go go back. No, what? Did you think something else?
Yes. Actually, one place where you see this is actually marked on the noun, because each of these things is an object. D-Bunny's creating glyphs. Bird is flying by the window. We're going to call that an object. And then J-Mouse is chopping vegetables. One way that this is often distinguished is by noun case. And so, for example, in something like a finish, the ones that have endpoints will be marked with the accusative, and the one without an endpoint will be marked with the partitive. And it may be a little muddier. Finnish is a natural language, so you never know. But something like that can work, where it's the one that doesn't have an endpoint. It's like, they are creating of something, or they're creating some things. Whereas, like, if you use a specific or a definite, for example, that's actually what we do in English. I am eating apples, eating a whole bunch. You never know when I'm going to stop. I'm eating an apple. That is something with an endpoint.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Excellent. All right, so then moving ahead, one tiny bit. Now the bird has flown past the window, and so, like, I still drew it so you could see the little tail feathers because I wanted to make sure you knew that it has happened. But the bird, for all intents and purposes, has flown past the window. It's done. And D-Bunny in that background now has a little ding alert. So this is the second text message of the little animation. All right, so we're looking at 4 events with creating glyphs, flying past a window, chopping vegetables, and dinging. Those are the verbs in play here. And so by tense, the creating of the glyphs, still present tense, but the bird flying past the window, now that's past tense because it's done. So it has happened in the past. The recent past, mind you, but it is the past. It is before the now on the timeline. J-Mouse is chopping in the present vegetables because that's happening right now in the moment. And the ding is also present tense because that happens right now. Versus aspect, we've got 2 continuing and 2 complete. So creating glyphs and chopping vegetables are the continuing, whereas flying past the window is done, so the bird flying past the window is complete, and the dinging of the computer, which again has no duration, and so once the event happens, it is over, and it is complete. All right, and then we're getting closer to the end here, and so the vegetables are getting fewer to choose from, but J-Mouse is still chopping, doing fennel right now, and D-Bunny is still creating those glyphs. And so there's not much to say here other than that, these are still present tense, both present tense because they're both happening right now on the timeline of this story, and they're both continuing because if you look at the events and their sort of ongoing states, they are happening right now. Finally, we get to the end. J-Mouse is done, standing back and smiling and surveying all of this beautiful work. Those bowls are filled now. The vegetables have been chopped. D-Bunny is still working, though, because, as David mentioned, that work is never done. Never done. And there is a text notification. All right, so we've got 3 things going on here. If we break it down by tense, Create glyphs, still present tense because it's still going on, but now chop is in the past tense. So the mouse chopped the vegetables in the past tense. And then we've got that computer dinging right now. Bing, happening now. Versus aspect, we've got creating the glyphs in the continuing aspect because it's still ongoing. But the chopping is completed, so now it's the mouse chopped, marked in the completed aspect, the vegetables. And then the ding is complete as well. And so that is those systems compared.
Yeah, I want to mention this is a very interesting thing because of course the animation is quite small, and I think it also represents honestly from our own lives. It's kind of a not unusual occurrence. It's a very small snapshot of what a day might look like, a small portion of a day. And so in many ways you look at this and it's a very small event where not much has happened. But when you look at it in terms of tense and aspect, you see all this movement.
Yeah.
Right? There's all this activity. And not only that, and again, it's a very small amount of activity, but you can see how different it looks depending on which lens you're looking at it through. And it's just basically two ways of describing and conceptualizing the same thing. And again, not much activity. You can imagine how much more boisterous this would be if you were like describing a basketball game or something like that, or something with a whole bunch of actors doing a whole lot of things. Yet even something very small and very quiet can be quite raucous, just in terms of the tense or aspectual marking. It's really lovely.
It's also interesting because, you were talking about how a lot of this is really just a difference in how you view the things, right? In terms of how you're going to end up talking about it is really a sort of point of view. And when you talk about these in the way of tense, that line in the middle of the timeline representing now changes for each frame. And so there's the dots where they are. It's like each frame has to be like its own little timeline, if you will. Whereas when you talk about aspect, the event doesn't need to change. It's just like, where are you in between the opening bracket and the closing bracket? The event is still there. So it's like you don't need a new one for each of the frames. Whereas timelines, you need a new one because now is different. And that's, to me, very interesting. And so speaking of that, that's actually a great lead-in to in the moment versus narration. And so in the moment, meaning like you're in the frame itself. And the reason I actually had those text notifications going off, by the way, was because I wanted to be able to present the scenario that somebody texted D-Bunny and said, what's happening right now? And so in the moment, what's happening? And so that's in the moment versus narration, where someone could ask, hey, remember when I texted you yesterday? What was happening? Where it's like now you're going to be narrating what was happening yesterday when the text occurred. And so like that was literally the only reason I had those dings going off, was so that way I could really think about it as like, how would someone answer what's happening right now? Right now. All right, so here I've pulled one sample slide. We're not going to do all the frames that were done for the past one, but just one sample frame that we've already talked about, where the bird has flown past the window, chopping and creating glyphs going on right now, and there is a text alert. So these are 4 different events.
By the way, I just want to mention really quickly, it's that drawing of fennel you've done is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you like it. All right, so when we were talking about it in the moment, so this slide is yellow for in the moment talking about it. Yellow doesn't mean in the moment, really. It was just that was the color that was already presented. We had the bunny creating glyphs, present tense. The bird fly window, where fly would be past tense. Mouse chop vegetables, where chop would be present tense, and then ding, computer ding, the ding is present tense. So we had 3 present tenses and 1 past. Now, if tomorrow, so the next day, right? So the next day someone said, what were you doing when I texted you? And you tell them, Well, now it's going to be relative to the timeline when they're asking, and so everything is past tense. And so it's like when you talk about it, it's like past tense. I created glyphs. The bird flew past the window. J Mouse had chopped vegetables, and the computer dinged. Those were the things in the past that happened because they were done. In terms of aspect, we had the creating of the glyphs was continuing, so it was ongoing. The bird flew past the window and it was complete, so that would be marked in the complete aspect. The vegetables being chopped is continuing, and then the computer dinging is complete. But now when you talk about you shift a day and you want to talk about what was going on yesterday when that text message went off, you don't actually have to change the aspects, because you can say relative to you texting me, here we were in this event, and so it's still continuing as of the time of the dinging. It's the flying was complete as of the ding, chopping was continuing, and then of course the ding itself was complete.
I want to mention for conlangers whose main language was English, there is, and I will acknowledge this, I will acknowledge the feeling, there's a kind of panic if you try to create a language with just an aspectual system, because you immediately think, how if you're talking about, the present or the past or the future, how would you know? First of all, I want you to acknowledge what you gain.
Yeah.
This is that. Suddenly it doesn't matter, right? The aspects didn't change. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple thing. It doesn't matter if you're in the past or the future anymore. You don't have to think about, okay, how do we change all of these verb tenses, because they're already set for you, right? You don't have to change that. But I also want to acknowledge, there's always a distinction between ways that we write our own language and ways that we use it in speech. And there always will be that distinction, because you have more time when you're writing. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what the language is. It doesn't matter how progressive or regressive society is or anything like that. You are always going to have more time to write. You can sit and reflect. You can't really do that when you're in the moment talking to somebody. But for English speakers especially, I want you to acknowledge the most popular way to tell stories. And I'm talking about you're sitting down with your friends and you're telling a story. And in fact, the best way to encapsulate it is thinking about the beginning to kind of I would say a modern tall tale, where you just say this sentence and, a whole flood of images comes to your mind, because it's it's them doing one of those things. And it's a guy walks into a bar, start of a joke, start of a tall tale, start of a wow, I can't believe that happened. But notice the tense. It's present, not just present, simple present. It's not a guy is walking into a bar. It's a guy walks into a bar. We often use the simple present tense to narrate our own stories. It's a very popular way of doing it. And also, the less formal, the more likely. And so it's you're chatting with your friends. You're like, okay, so yesterday I walk into the office, I go to my desk, and there's an email. And I read the email, and my boss is telling me, okay, everybody come into the office. So we all go into the office, and you see, it's present tense the entire time. It is simple present tense the entire time. It's not past tense, even though it's very obvious that we're talking about past tense. It is present tense the entire time. The only time you switch it up is, say, let's continue the story. So it's so we all go into the office, and my boss is sitting there and he's writing on a piece of paper. Suddenly we've switched. But we haven't switched tenses, we've switched aspects. Because in this part of the story, I want, we use the simple past when it's just event, 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 event. We switch to the present progressive when it's at the time that event happened, something else was ongoing. Mm-hmm. And so instinctually, we know what it's like to only use an aspectual distinction. And we do it. It's very common. It's just that we don't think of it that way, because our language is so tense heavy, we don't even recognize it. But it's something that we know and we can all do very, very easily. And so if you're having trouble wrapping your brain around it, think about that. And think about how comfortably we use the present tense to talk about the past tense. There's no question. Nobody stops you and says, wait. Is this happening right now? It just doesn't happen.
I think another, well, in one quick thing is at one point while you were talking, I didn't want to stop you because it was really just such a beautiful
Sure.
explanation. But at one point you said there was a switch from simple past to present progressive, and you meant simple present.
Simple present,
and
sorry.
For anyone who was listening to that and went, wait, what? Like that was just a little slip up.
Sorry.
But one thing I do want to point out is if you want to look into that phenomenon that David's talking about a little bit more, it's called the use of the historical present. And so what that means is it's present tense to refer to history. And this happens also in academia. Whenever you are writing about, like what people have said, you say like you can legit, like just straight up be like, oh, well, Goldberg 2001 argues this, and present it all in the present tense, where it's like you've just provided the year that it was 22 years ago, 23 years ago now, and you can still use present tense to, argues, writes, claims, all of these present tense verbs for something that you've already situated in the past as having been quite past.
And this is not just like, one department or anything. This is also something it's always, it's growing pains for English majors as well. Because, you write books about novels. Most of the novels you're writing about, especially at the beginning, are quite old. And so often, you use the past tense when describing it. And they always say, you can't do that. When you're describing something that's happening in the book, you use the present tense. And it's like, why? It's like, look, that's just the way you do it. And it's true.
Yeah. It reads better.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And by the way, before we leave it, another little factoid about English and aspect. This is one of my favorite usages. I call it, rather than the narrative present, it's the counterfactual. It is the, not just counterfactual, it is the sports commentator counterfactual present tense, which is extraordinarily common. It is used by sportscasters when they are looking at replays. And so, like, if you're watching American football and it's like a guy grabs the ball and runs all the way to the end zone and gets a touchdown, and they're like, wow, that was amazing. Now let's look at the replay. And then they start to look at the replay. He's going slow, and he says, and say, watch number 44, Johnson right here. If he doesn't make this block, then the running back doesn't make it all the way to the end zone. And they use the present tense there, and what they mean by that, they only use it to present counterfactual evidence.
Although I will say they also use present tense to narrate what's happening on screen as well.
Which is the actual present tense.
Yes, yeah. Well, yes. Except in a replay, it's no longer present.
No.
And so, but they'll still say, he runs it. And it's like,
but
they're watching the replay, so it's
right.
already happened. But anyway, so that's another, also, again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of this can be really messy because when you start looking at it in natural languages, we use these things in such a variety of ways that are unexpected based on the grammatical definitions of the linguistic features. Yeah. And that's how it happens. Now, David was talking about some English, and I, was ending this presentation on some English examples. And one of the reasons I specifically wanted to talk about English was because, one, I do work with a lot of conlangers whose native language is English. And two, if your native language is English, or if you're overly familiar with English verb styles in particular, it can really, as David had mentioned, kind of mess you up a little bit when you start thinking about tense and aspect. In part because the English verb system is kind of famous, notoriously so, for really doing some odd things with tense, but then it's like we're in the process of moving to, like, do we really want to prioritize aspect instead? Like, it's kind of like we're doing this thing because we do have inflections that are tenses. And I put here that English has two inflected tenses, which is not incorrect, but I put it as past and present, when really a better way to define this is we have a past tense that is inflected and then a non-past, which I just call it present because when you look at a lot of grammatical analyses of English, they refer to it as the simple present tense. Again, though, it's really non-past because what it means is it's either present or future when it's got this sort of tense marking on it. And so we do not, though, have an inflected future tense because future is handled through periphrastic means in English as of right now. It's not like Spanish, which actually has an inflected future tense. So it's become grammaticalized to the point of inflection. English is still periphrastic, and it's still, I feel like if anything is going to get potentially in the future, is really going to get grammaticalized to the point where it could become a tense marker. I'm going to say it's going to be the gonna. I'm gonna. Because I feel like that's already, I'm a leave. Like eventually it's gonna, I think, potentially. Maybe not. Maybe it'll never actually do it. Maybe we'll come up with something brand new and we're going to leave it behind. Who knows? But those are the tenses. And again, we do prioritize tense when you look at our system, as David had mentioned, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But however, we do also have quite a bit of aspect marking available to us that we use a lot. Overly so. In some cases, to the point where simple present tense, in terms of like it representing the here and now, what's happening in the moment, like we don't even let that be simple present tense usually. In fact, when we're talking about, if I text David right now, what are you doing? David's response is actually going to be aspectually marked because it's not going to be I write. It's going to be I am writing. And so like that. Well, you're not actually writing right now. Right now you're doing a podcast. Yep. So it would be not I record podcast. It would be like I am recording a podcast. And so like that's the aspect marking side of it. So we're going to look back at this frame where it's the same frame that we used in the past example. So 4 things going on: creating the glyphs, the bird has flown past the window, J Mouse is chopping the vegetables, and the computer dings. And if someone were to say what's happening right now, in English, we would say the bunny is creating glyphs, a bird just flew past the window, mouse is chopping vegetables, the computer dinged. And so we do get, simple past for flew and dinged, but for what's happening right now, we're getting this tense and aspect grouping, where is as the auxiliary verb is actually carrying the tense. And so it's present tense. It's marked by the form of is. And then together as the periphrastic construction, we've got a form of be followed by a verb in its ing form. And that creates progressive, or the ongoing, the continuing. And so put together, this is what we often, call in English the present progressive. But you could have the past progressive. You could have other forms. And so it's like that is where the tense is marked. On the flip side of that, something that's just in the simple tense itself, like the simple past, the bird flew past the window, or the bird just flew past the window with an adverb in there. And it's in the simple past, where it's just flew is marked in the past tense. Anything to add to that? No. If we were to shift this to like what happened then, so again, like a day later, someone said, hey, when I texted you, what was happening? This is where you would get the past progressive form, where an English speaker would likely describe this as the bunny was creating glyphs, a bird flew past the window, the mouse was chopping vegetables, and the computer dinged. And so you do get that past progressive with was creating, again, contrasted with the is creating from the other, whereas past tense is still past tense. So another way is like actually putting this together in a narration as an event. And you could say a sentence like, as D Bunny was creating glyphs and J Mouse was chopping vegetables, D Mouse's computer dinged and a bird flew past the window. Now, one way that I want to say that because it is hard to, like, when you're talking about English system and saying, well, tense is prioritized because it gets, it is inflected directly on the verb. It's there. It's really got to be there for a finite verb. Is it tensed or not? Like, that's what is a finite verb in our language system. So it is prioritized in grammatical ways, but also semantically it is, because while this is a very natural way of saying all of these events, we could actually remove those aspectual markings and just present it in solid past tense, and everyone's going to understand. We could say, as D. Bunny created glyphs and J. Mouse chopped vegetables, D. Mouse's computer dinged and a bird flew past the window. And it's just as beautiful.
Yeah. Honestly, showing those last two together, in fact, maybe before you put this up, you can put a slide with both of those on there. It really is difficult because it's like, you look at those two sentences, the only thing that changed were the aspects of the first two verbs.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask an English speaker, how are they different? I don't know. They basically say the same thing in a very slightly different way. That's wow.
And that's, again, we've got a system that prioritizes the tense over the aspect of it all, and so we're able to play with those distinctions when it comes to using tense. Whenever it comes, though, to an aspect system, you would be marking them as continuing or completed,
Yeah.
and so, like, you could do things. You could imagine an auxiliary that tenses it, and they would still be able to do it with or without the tense auxiliary, in the same way that we can do it with or without that progressive marking.
I think I know what this is indicative of, that, the tense is really primary in English. Mm-hmm. It's because if we see a simple past tense form like this, created, chopped, and so on, we are used to having that be ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it could be describing something that a discrete event that happened in the past, but it could also be describing an event that was ongoing in the past. And we're used to that ambiguity. And so when we see this, it's like, well, it's not really different from the other one that is specifically aspectual, because we're just used to it. Man.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Woo! That was fun.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then I just have this final slide sort of reserved for final discussion. I wish, like, in a situation like this, especially where this topic was born out of people on Discord asking questions. We have patrons on Discord asking questions about tense and aspect, and it really got me thinking with, I have a lot more to say about, a tense system versus an aspect system. And so that was why I wanted to focus this entire podcast on it. But it's always hard when you do a podcast recording, because it's like, what I would love to be able to do in this final discussion is reach through the screen and say, do any of you have questions? What, lingering questions do you have, or clarifications would you like? Because this was really meant to be a sort of teaching episode, and it's difficult when at the end of it you don't get to find out if it actually landed well.
I'll make a final comment about conlanging, because I think there's a lesson to be drawn from this that applies generally, especially in linguistics. We will analyze languages and try to draw the maximal number of distinctions that they make. And there's also a propensity, it's almost like there's some level of enjoyment and satisfaction in coming up with unique terminology for everything. Mm-hmm. Things like, the sportscaster counterfactual present tense. But with a conlanger, this can be very dangerous, because what you start with is language, actual language data and what it is. What you abstract away is more categories than that language itself reifies. Mm-hmm. In other words, for any language, when it's analyzed, there is going to be a mismatch in the number of things that are encoded and the elements that are used to encode them. And there is always going to be more things that they encode than are used to encode them. There's always going to be more things. But if you start up here with the things that can be encoded, there is a very simple kind of desire to be like, okay, if we've got 12 things that need to be encoded, then we need at least 12 things on the other end to encode them. Even though a natural language will have like 7 to encode those 12 things. And so when you're looking, especially going back and thinking about this discussion we've had about tense and aspect and about English specifically, I want you to remember that what is happening when we need to describe various things, we're using what we've already got and figuring out how it is that what we already have can possibly work to describe whatever it is we need to describe. We're not coming up with new stuff every single time to describe each new nuanced area of tensor aspect. And especially with comparing it to nouns, it's like with noun number, it's like, all right, you can have discussions there. It gets interesting, but at a certain point, like it's pretty cut and dry, one of something, two of something, a bunch of something, or so on. There is no non-artificial way to take an event or time and divide it into discrete units. It is always completely artificial and completely arbitrary, and it can change. It's too vast, whereas like something like noun number, by comparison, is so simple and so concrete and so obvious. And that's why it's like at a certain point, it's like, well, it becomes a little bit pointless to just keep coming up with new things. It's why we have like a future tense and a past tense, and at most like, near future and far future, because it's like otherwise like future 1 minute from now, 2 minutes from now, 5 minutes from now, there's just no end to it.
And another, I think, important thing to remember is because I think it can be hard for conlangers who want to encode all of these distinctions and want to say, but we need to be able to distinguish this from this. I urge you to remember that there are other ways to do it, including adverbs. And so, like David gave an example where it's like, well, and this isn't the exact example, but we can totally say in English, I leave on Thursday.
Yeah.
And it's simple present tense, but like the adverbial information in that preposition phrase on Thursday says it's in the future. And in the same way, we can say like the bird flew past the window, the bird just flew past the window. I use that little adverb that maybe you didn't notice I put that in the example English, but it's like it felt pertinent at the time to be like, well, it just happened. And so I can add in that little adverb, which is just a word in English that can be used to really help situate things relative to another event. And they aren't encoded on the verb. So you don't need that on the verb system just because it's something that you can think about as a human. You have a lot of other ways to do it, which is also, by the way, how languages have things like no number marking on nouns. They don't need it because, quite frankly, context quite often is going to dictate it. But also, if you need to, you can always add modifiers and say many bird outside window, where it's like, well, now you know there's more than one because I used an adjective to say there are many of them. You don't need the grammatical marking if you think about other ways of supporting the system. And so that's just another thing. Just remember that just because something isn't grammatically marked doesn't mean your speakers can't distinguish it. So.
All right.
Yeah.
I hope you feel better about this podcast now. Huh?
I was very nervous. I really was. Because it's a big topic. It's, the debut of my animation. In a podcast that no one's going to see it. No, I will post it with the resources so that way you can see it if you're listening to this. So All right. So hopefully you all enjoyed it. Hopefully it gave you some things to think about and different ways to express it. And please remember again that the example tenses and aspects that we use throughout the discussion are just that. They're just examples. And if you're interested in learning more, I definitely encourage you to look, especially in different aspect markings, because as David mentioned, tenses are usually going to be either some sort of past, non-past, future, non-future, past, present, future, maybe a distant past that gets used in storytelling or something that's happened years ago, maybe a distant future that gets used for something like 10 years down the road versus like tomorrow. But really, those are kind of what you're looking at with tense systems. On aspects, I feel like there's more that can really get done. And so just because I only presented those three, remember that there are other systems that are quite rich and that mark things very differently. They may not even have the same base level distinctions as these three. So definitely look into it to get inspired to see what other languages do. All right. And with that, ready to sign off?
Yeah.
Well, in that case, stay grammar, everyone, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
Bye, everybody.